Laugh all you want, Signor, but the earth remembers what the ink forgets, the old man whispered, his voice as dry as the dust on the plantation roads. Bento stood in the center of the grand dining room of Fazenda Alvorada, his back hunched from decades of labor, yet his head held with a dignity that seemed to infuriate the woman sitting across from him. Donna Custodia, the widow of the Baron, let out a sharp, melodic laugh that didn't reach her cold eyes. In her hand she held a brittle, yellowed piece of parchment, a document so blank it looked like a cruel joke played by time itself. She waved it in the air, the flickering candlelight from the silver candelabras dancing across the empty surface. To her, it was nothing but trash, a senile old slave's obsession. But she didn't know that this empty paper was about to set her world on fire and reveal a secret that the Brazilian Empire had tried to bury for decades. Before we dive into this journey of shadows and hidden truths, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt that a great injustice was being hidden right in front of your eyes? Stay with me until the very end, because what Joaquim, the man standing in the corner of that room, discovered about that paper will change everything you think you know about power and bloodlines. If you enjoy stories of deep emotion and the triumph of the human spirit, please leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10 at the end. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and join our community. Your support is what allows these stories to be told. Now let us return to the suffocating heat of the Paraíba Valley, where the scent of coffee and the stench of corruption are one and the same. Joaquim watched the scene from the shadows, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned against a mahogany sideboard. He was a man who had once known the marbled halls of the imperial court in Rio de Janeiro, a man who had once held the power to draft the laws of the land. Now he was a broken shadow of his former self, a functional alcoholic whose only remaining possession of value was a silver inkwell shaped like a lion's head. It sat on his desk in the small, cramped office Custodia provided for him, a constant reminder of the man he used to be before he refused to forge a document for a minister and found himself exiled to this rural purgatory. His life at Fazenda Alvorada was a cycle of ink and shame. He was the doctor to the locals, the man who handled the widow's ledgers, her contracts, and her ever-expanding land claims. He knew every shady deal she had made to swallow the neighboring farms. He saw the way she treated the human beings under her control, not as people, but as numbers to be squeezed until they broke. And yet, he did nothing. He drank his cheap cachaça and stared at the flickering whale oil lamp, wondering when exactly his soul had shriveled up and died. But there was something about Bento that always made Joaquim pause. The old man wasn't like the others. He was the oldest resident of the plantation, a living map of the valley's history. They said Bento could walk to the edge of any forest and point out exactly where the boundary stones had been placed in 1808 when the royal family first arrived. Custodia hated him for it. She had tried to beat the locations out of him, tried to break his spirit to make her land thefts easier. But Bento remained silent, protecting a truth that only he seemed to understand. "Look at this, Joaquim," Custodia said, her voice dripping with mockery as she turned toward him. She held the parchment up to his face. "This is what he's been hiding under his floorboards for 20 years, a blank sheet of paper. He thinks it's a deed. He thinks he owns something." Joaquim stepped forward, his eyes bleary, but his professional instinct still sharp. He looked at the parchment. It was high-quality vellum, the kind used only by the highest offices in Rio. It was old, yes, but it hadn't been damaged by moisture or insects. It was pristine. And it was indeed completely blank. "It's just trash, Donna Custodia," Joaquim muttered, wanting nothing more than to return to his bottle. The old man is confused. Age does that to the mind. "I want it gone," she snapped, her silver-tipped cane striking the floor with a sharp crack. "It's become a symbol. The workers talk about it. They think Bento has some secret protection. I want you to burn it, right here, in front of him. Let him watch his imaginary kingdom turn to smoke." Custodia moved the parchment toward the flame of a nearby candle. Bento didn't move. He didn't plead. He just watched with those unnervingly clear eyes. As the heat of the flame licked at the bottom of the vellum, Joaquim leaned in closer, his heart suddenly skipping a beat. He saw it, a faint reddish glow appearing within the fibers of the paper. It wasn't the black of ink, but a subtle crimson reaction that shouldn't have been there. His breath hitched. He knew that reaction. He had seen it only once before, in the secret archives of the royal notaries. It was a chemical signature used for shadow decrees, documents written in a secret ink designed to remain invisible unless treated with a specific royal reagent or a very precise, sustained degree of heat. "Wait!" Joachim shouted, reaching out and snatching the paper from Custodia's hand just before the edges caught fire. The widow froze, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "What are you doing, you drunkard? How dare you touch me?" Joachim's heart was racing now, the fog of alcohol momentarily cleared by a surge of pure, cold adrenaline. There's a flaw in the vellum, Sinha," he stammered, trying to hide his discovery. "If you burn it here, the smell of the treated animal skin will linger in the dining room for days. It's foul. Let me take it to the office. I'll dispose of it properly in the stove." Custodia studied him for a long, agonizing moment. She looked at the paper, then back at Joachim's sweating face. "Take the garbage away, and then get back to work on the eviction notices for those settlers on the northern ridge. I want them gone by the end of the month." Joachim nodded quickly, tucking the parchment into his coat. He didn't look at Bento as he hurried out of the room, but he felt the old man's gaze on his back like a physical weight. He fled to his small office, locking the door behind him. He ignored the bottle of cachaça sitting on his desk, and instead pulled the Silver Lion inkwell toward him. He laid the parchment flat on the desk, his hands shaking so much he had to grip the edge of the wood. He brought his lamp closer, letting the heat radiate onto the surface without letting the flame touch it. Slowly, ever so slowly, the faint red lines began to reappear. They weren't just random marks. They were letters, calligraphy, the elegant sweeping hand of a royal scribe. "My God," Joachim whispered, the air in the small room feeling suddenly too thin. But as soon as he moved the lamp away, the red lines faded back into the white of the vellum. It wasn't enough. The heat was too uneven, too dangerous. He needed the reagent, the specific mixture of minerals and acids that would lock the ink into a visible state. He knew the formula, but the ingredients were rare, expensive, and controlled. If he were caught trying to obtain them, Custodia would have him whipped or worse. But why would Bento have a royal shadow decree? These were documents used only for the most sensitive matters of state, succession, secret treaties, or the protection of the crown's private interests. The next morning, the atmosphere at Alvarado was even more tense than usual. A young man named Tiago was working in the coffee drying yards, his skin bronzed by the sun and covered in the dust of the harvest. He was an orphan of the Senzala, a boy who had grown up under the lash like all the others. But as Joachim watched him from his window, he noticed something strange. Bento was standing nearby, watching Tiago with a look of profound, almost religious devotion. Joachim stepped outside, the humid heat of the valley hitting him like a wall. He made his way toward the stocks, where Bento had been sent as punishment for stealing the paper that was supposedly worthless. The old man's legs were locked in the heavy timber, his body exposed to the blistering sun. Joachim leaned down, pretending to inspect the lock. "Why do you have it, Bento?" he whispered. "That paper. It's not empty. You know that, don't you?" Bento looked up, his cracked lips forming a weak smile. "The ink sleeps, Doctor. It waits for the one who has the light." "I saw the red glow," Joachim said, his voice urgent. "I know what it is, but I don't know who it's for. Why have you risked your life for a piece of paper?" Bento leaned forward as much as the stocks would allow, his voice a rasping thread. "It's not for me. It's for the boy with the star, the one the world tried to forget." "Tiago?" Joachim asked, confused. "He's just a worker. He's nobody." "He is the truth," Bento said, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "And the truth is a debt that must be paid. Look at his shoulder, Doctor. Look for the mark of the Braganzas." Joachim felt a cold shiver run down his spine despite the heat. The Braganzas? The royal house? It was impossible, a child of the crown here in the dirt of a coffee plantation. But then he remembered the rumors, the secret scandals of the court, the princesses who disappeared for a year, the accidents that claimed the lives of inconvenient heirs. But this was only the beginning. Joachim realized that he wasn't just holding a piece of paper, he was holding a fuse that could blow the entire social order of the empire apart. If Tiago was who Bento claimed he was, then Donna Custodia wasn't just a cruel widow, she was a jailer of the throne. As Joachim walked back to his office, he saw Donna Custodia watching him from the veranda of the big house. She held her silver-tipped cane like a scepter, her eyes tracking his every move. She knew he was hiding something. He could feel her suspicion growing, a dark cloud over the plantation. He entered his room and looked at the silver lion inkwell. He had a choice to make. He could destroy the paper, forget what Bento said, and sink back into the comfort of his bottle. Or he could find the ingredients for the reagent and uncover the truth, even if it meant his own death. He reached for the bottle of cachaça, his hand hovering over the glass. But then he looked at the parchment again, sitting there, silent and invisible. He thought of Tiago's face and the scars on Bento's back. For the first time in years, Joachim didn't feel like a broken clerk. He felt like a man with a weapon. But how could he get the chemicals he needed? The plantation's pharmacy was kept under lock and key by Custodia herself, and the town was miles away, filled with her informants. He was trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by enemies. And then he remembered the letter he had received that morning. The Visita de Corazon was coming. The king's notary, a high-ranking official from the capital, was due to arrive in 2 weeks to settle the very land disputes Custodia was so eager to finalize. The clock was ticking. If he didn't reveal the secret before the notary signed those documents, the truth would be buried forever under a mountain of legal lies. Joachim sat down at his desk and dipped his pen into the silver lion. He wasn't going to write an eviction notice. He was going to write a plan. But as he started to scribe, he heard a soft knock on his door. "Doctor?" a young voice whispered. It was Tiago. Joachim's heart hammered against his ribs. The boy was standing there, his eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "Bento told me to come. He said you have something that belongs to my mother." The loop was open. The secret was breathing. And Joachim knew that from this moment on, there was no turning back. What happened next would either liberate a kingdom or bury them all in an unmarked grave. Joachim froze. The voice was small, barely a breath against the heavy wooden door, but it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. He looked at the boy standing in the corridor. Tiago was shivering, his clothes damp from the sudden tropical downpour that was turning the plantation's red earth into a thick, treacherous sludge. The boy's eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering light of the whale oil lamp, and in that moment, Joachim didn't see a coffee worker. He saw a mirror of the tragedy that had been playing out in the shadows of Fazenda Alvorada for nearly 20 years. "Come in, boy," Joachim whispered, his voice cracking. He grabbed Tiago by the arm and pulled him into the small, cramped office, bolting the door behind them. The room smelled of old paper, spilled ink, and the sharp, fermented tang of the cachaça Joachim used to drown his conscience. He pointed to a stool near the desk, right next to the silver lion inkwell that seemed to watch them with its hollow, metallic eyes. "Bento told you to come?" Joachim asked, trying to keep his hands from shaking. "What did he tell you exactly?" Tiago wiped his face with a tattered sleeve. "He said you have the paper that doesn't speak. He said my mother died protecting it, and that if I didn't find out what was on it before the king's notary arrived, I would never be more than a ghost in these fields. Doctor, please, what is that paper? Why does Sina Custodia want to burn it so badly?" Joachim looked at the boy, then at the parchment sitting on his desk. To any normal eye, it was blank, a useless scrap of vellum, but Joachim knew better. He reached out and grabbed Tiago's shoulder, turning him toward the lamp. The old man mentioned a mark, a star. "Show me." Tiago hesitated, his eyes darting to the locked door. He slowly pulled back the collar of his rough linen shirt, revealing his left shoulder. There, etched into the skin like a brand of fate, was a birthmark in the perfect shape of a 5-pointed star. But it wasn't just a birthmark. Upon closer inspection, Joachim saw the faint, raised edges of a surgical scar around it, as if someone had tried to cut it out or hide it years ago. "My God," Joachim murmured, the breath leaving his lungs. "It's not just a mark, it's a claim." But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. Joaquim realized that if he could see the mark, so could Donna Custodia. She had likely known about it since the day Tiago was born, keeping him in the fields not just as a worker, but as a prisoner of his own bloodline. The empty deed wasn't just land, it was a death warrant if handled incorrectly. "Listen to me, Tiago," Joaquim said, his voice low and urgent. "You cannot tell anyone you were here. Not the other workers, not the house servants, and especially not the Heir. Donna Custodia is looking for a reason to make you disappear before the notary arrives. She thinks that by burning that paper she burns your life. But she's wrong." "Can you make it speak, Doctor?" Tiago asked, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and terror. "I can," Joaquim replied. "But I need things I don't have. Chemicals, rare minerals that aren't found in a simple plantation pharmacy. I have to find a way to get into the big house's private medical chest without being seen." But there was a catch. Donna Custodia never left the keys to the medical chest out of her sight. She wore them on a heavy silver chain around her waist, a constant reminder of her control over the health and lives of everyone at Alvorada. If Joaquim wanted those ingredients, he would have to step into the lion's den. The next few days were a blur of calculated risks and mounting tension. Joaquim began his investigation into the past, seeking out the only people who might remember the night Tiago was born. He found his first lead in the laundry, near the river where the sound of the rushing water drowned out private conversations. There sat Maria do Rosario, an elderly woman whose hands were gnarled and white from decades of scrubbing the Baron's linens. She was a woman who saw everything but said nothing, a living archive of the plantation's sins. "Maria," Joaquim whispered, kneeling beside her as she beat a heavy tablecloth against a stone. "I need to know about the stranger. The woman who came here 18 years ago during the Great Storm." Maria stopped her work, her eyes clouding over with a memory that clearly still haunted her. She looked around, ensuring the foreman wasn't within earshot. "She didn't come here, Doctor. She was brought, in a carriage with no markings, pulled by horses that were nearly dead from exhaustion. The Baron himself carried her into the guest wing. He told us she was a distant cousin, but cousins don't have silk dresses with the royal crest hidden in the lining." "And the baby?" Joaquim pressed. "She died before the sun rose," Maria said, a single tear tracing a path through the soap suds on her cheek. "But before she went, she gave Bento a leather pouch. She told him to hide it to keep it safe until the boy with the star was old enough to understand. The Baron searched everywhere for that pouch. He tore up the floorboards, he beat the servants, but he never found it. He thought she had burned it. He didn't know Bento was smarter than all of them." Joaquim felt the puzzle pieces clicking into place, and the picture they formed was terrifying. This wasn't just a local land dispute. This was a dynastic scandal that reached all the way back to the imperial palace in Rio. If the empty deed was indeed a royal land grant, it meant that the entire Paraíba Valley didn't belong to the Baron's estate. It belonged to the boy currently drying coffee in the yard. But as Joaquim gathered these fragments of the truth, he felt a cold shadow falling over him. Donna Custodia was no fool. She noticed Joaquim's frequent walks to the laundry and the slave quarters. She noticed that he was drinking less, his eyes becoming sharper, more focused. One evening, as Joaquim was returning to his office, he found the foreman, a brutal man named Silveira, standing by his door. Silveira was playing with a heavy leather whip, his eyes fixed on Joaquim with a predatory grin. "The Signor wants to see you, Doctor," Silveira said, his voice like gravel. "In the library now. She says you're taking too long with those eviction notices. She thinks maybe you've forgotten who pays for your cachaça." Joaquim's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt the weight of the parchment hidden inside his waistcoat, the empty paper that could either save them or hang them both. He took a deep breath, straightened his coat, and followed the foreman toward the big house. Inside, the library was thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive tobacco. Donna Custodia was sitting behind a massive oak desk, the Baron's portrait looming over her like a dark guardian. She didn't look up when Joaquim entered. She was busy writing in a large leather-bound ledger, the book of names and debts that ruled the valley. "Sit down, Joaquim," she said, her voice smooth and cold as marble. Joaquim sat, his muscles tense. He watched her hand move across the page, the scratching of the quill the only sound in the room. "I've been hearing strange things," she continued, finally looking up. Her eyes were like shards of ice. "I hear you've been talking to the laundry women. I hear you've been asking about things that happened long before you arrived here, things that are none of your concern. I was just gathering historical context for the land titles, Sinha," Joachim lied, his voice remarkably steady, "to ensure the notary has no grounds to question your claims." Custodia leaned forward, her silver-tipped cane leaning against the desk. "The notary will sign whatever I put in front of him, Joachim. Do you know why? Because I have the power to make people disappear, and he has the wisdom to stay alive, but you seem to be losing your wisdom." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small gold-embossed envelope. She tossed it onto the desk. "This arrived today from Rio. It's a warrant. It seems the ministry hasn't forgotten the little accident with the forged documents 3 years ago. They know where you are, Joachim." The blood drained from Joachim's face. This was her leverage. She wasn't just threatening his job, she was threatening his life. "I can make this warrant vanish," she whispered, a cruel smile touching her lips. "Or I can hand you over to the Imperial Guard when they arrive with the notary. The choice is yours. Burn the old man's paper, and forget everything you think you know about the boy with the star." Joachim stared at the envelope. He felt the familiar pull of cowardice, the urge to crawl back into his office and drink until the world went dark. But then he thought of Bento in the stocks. He thought of Tiago's shoulder, and he realized that if he ran now, he would be forged into a lie forever. "I understand, Sinha," Joachim said, standing up. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something on the side table near the door. A small crystal decanter of what looked like cleaning fluid for the Baron's silver collection. He recognized the sharp, biting scent of nitric acid, one of the key ingredients for the royal reagent. He had to get it. But how? Silvera was watching him from the doorway, and Custodia was still staring at him with that predatory gaze. This was the moment. The open loop was narrowing, and the risk was becoming absolute. Joachim knew that if he failed now, there would be no redemption. He had to steal the acid, find the rest of the ingredients, and reveal the hidden script before the notary's carriage crested the hill. But what he didn't know was that Donna Custodia had already set a trap. She knew he would try to take the acid, and she was waiting for him to make his move. Joachim stared at the crystal decanter on the side table, the biting scent of nitric acid stinging his nostrils even from a distance. It was the key. Without it, the empty deed would remain a silent scrap of vellum, and Tiago would remain a ghost in the coffee fields. But Donna Custodia was watching him with the eyes of a hawk, her hand resting firmly on the gold-embossed warrant from Rio. He knew that one wrong move, one tremor in his hands would lead him straight to the gallows. "Is something wrong, Joachim?" Custodia asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You've been staring at that table for quite some time. Perhaps you've finally realized that your time is running out." "Just the light, Sinha," Joachim stammered, forcing a cough. He played the part of the broken drunkard, letting his shoulders slump and his gaze wander aimlessly. "The glare from the silver is giving me a headache. I'll be on my way. The eviction notices will be ready by dawn." As he turned toward the door, he purposely stumbled. It was a calculated risk, a clumsy lurch that sent his elbow grazing the side table. The decanter rattled, and for a heart-stopping second, he thought it would shatter on the floor. Custodia let out a sound of pure disgust. "Get out! You're a disgrace to your profession, Joachim," she hissed. "Silvera, escort this animal back to his cage." In the confusion of the moment, as Joachim flailed to steady himself, his fingers closed around the small glass stopper of the nitric acid vial. He didn't take the whole decanter, that would be noticed immediately. Instead, he palmed a small secondary bottle of concentrated reagent used for testing the purity of the Baron's silver. He tucked it into his sleeve, the glass cold against his skin, and let the foreman shove him out into the rain. But stealing the acid was only the first step. To create the royal reagent, he needed more. He needed rare minerals, cobalt salts, and a specific type of refined potash, things that weren't found in a common plantation storehouse, and he had nothing left to trade. Nothing. except the one thing that connected him to his life before the shame of Rio. He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a heavy gold pocket watch. It had been his father's, a gift for his graduation from the Faculty of Law. It was his escape fund, the only thing he could sell to buy a passage out of the country if things went wrong. Now it was the only currency he had to buy justice. Under the cover of the pouring rain, Joachim sought out a travelling merchant who had sought shelter in the workers' quarters. The man was a peddler of miracle tonics and rare spices, a man who didn't ask questions if the gold was yellow enough. "I need your entire stock of cobalt blue and the refined salts from the northern mines," Joachim whispered, his voice barely audible over the thunder. The merchant eyed the gold watch, his greedy fingers tracing the intricate engravings. "That's a high price for a handful of dirt, Doctor. What are you planning to do? Turn lead into gold?" "I'm planning to turn a lie into a legacy," Joachim replied, his voice colder than he had ever felt. "Do we have a deal?" The trade was made in the shadows of a damp barn, the scent of wet hay and desperation filling the air. Joachim returned to his office with a small leather pouch tucked against his chest. He was now penniless, a man with no exit strategy and a warrant for his arrest waiting in the widow's desk. But as he looked at the silver lion inkwell, he felt a strange sense of peace. He was no longer a victim of his past, he was the architect of a future. He spent the night in a fever of chemical precision. Using the silver lion as his crucible, he mixed the nitric acid with the minerals, the solution bubbling and emitting a faint, acrid smoke. He had to be perfect. One drop too much and the vellum would dissolve, one drop too little, and the ink would remain invisible. But that was only the beginning of the danger, he whispered to himself. The clock on the wall ticked away the hours like a heartbeat. The king's notary was less than 3 days away. As the sun began to peek through the Atlantic forest, turning the mist over the coffee fields into a shimmering veil of gold, Joachim finally dipped a fine brush into the crimson liquid. He touched it to the corner of the empty deed. Slowly, like a ghost rising from the grave, a single word appeared in deep, royal red. Decree. His hands shook. He wasn't just looking at land titles. He was looking at a confession of a royal kidnapping, a document that proved the Baron hadn't bought this land. He had been paid in territory to hide a child of the throne. And then he heard the sound that made his blood turn to ice. It wasn't the rain. It was the sound of horses. Many horses. And the sharp military command of a sergeant. The notary hadn't waited for the 3-day mark. The visita de correction had arrived early, and Silvera, the foreman, was already heading toward Joachim's office with a squad of armed guards. "Doctor," Silvera shouted, kicking the door, "the Sinha has changed her mind. She wants that paper destroyed now, and she wants you in irons. Open up." Joachim looked at the document, the ink still wet and revealing the truth that would destroy the widow. He had no time to hide it and nowhere to run. The loop was closing, and the trap was about to spring. The wood of the door groaned under Silvera's boot, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped office. Joachim's heart felt like a trapped bird beating against his ribs. He looked at the parchment on his desk. The word decree was glowing in a deep, blood-red hue, a silent scream of truth in a room full of lies. If the foreman saw this, it wouldn't just be the end of the secret, it would be the end of Tiago's life. "Open up, you drunkard!" Silvera roared again, the hinges beginning to give way. "I know you're in there with your bottles and your treason!" Joachim had only seconds. He grabbed the damp parchment, but he couldn't hide it in his clothes. The reagent was still wet, and the scent was unmistakable. His eyes landed on the silver lion inkwell. It was a heavy, ornate piece, a relic of his life in the capital. With a strength born of pure desperation, he twisted the lion's head. It was a secret he had kept since his days in the imperial notary. The inkwell had a hollow base designed for storing sensitive seals. He shoved the parchment inside, screwed the head back on, and threw the silver lion into a pile of discarded ledgers just as the door burst open. Silvera charged in, followed by 2 armed guards. The foreman's face was twisted in a cruel grin. His whip coiled like a snake at his hip. He didn't even look for the paper. He went straight for Joachim, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "The Sinha is done playing games with you, Doctor," Silvera hissed, the smell of tobacco and rain heavy on his breath. "The notary is here, and he's brought a gift for you, a pair of iron bracelets and a one-way ticket back to the dungeons of Rio." Joachim gasped for air, his feet dangling inches off the floor. I have the eviction notices. They are ready." "Forget the notices." Silvera laughed, tossing Joachim toward the guards. "She doesn't need them anymore. She has the notary's ear, and by sunset everything in this valley will officially belong to her. Search the room. The sinner wants to burn it before the banquet." The guards tore the office apart. They threw the books from the shelves, ripped open the mattress and smashed Joachim's few remaining bottles of cachaça. One guard picked up the silver lion inkwell, weighing it in his hand. Joachim's breath hitched. He forced himself to look away, to pretend interest in the broken glass on the floor. "Nothing but junk," the guard muttered, tossing the silver lion back into the corner. It landed with a dull thud, the secret within remaining silent. They dragged Joachim out into the courtyard. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, but the atmosphere at Fazenda Alvorada had shifted. A grand carriage, bearing the imperial crest of the House of Braganza, sat in front of the big house. A squad of the Imperial Guard, their uniforms bright even in the grey light, stood at attention. Donna Custodia stood on the veranda, her black mourning dress making her look like a vulture perched over a kill. Beside her was a tall, thin man with a sharp nose and spectacles, Dr. Cavalcanti, the king's notary. He was a man Joachim recognized from the court, a man known for his cold adherence to the law and his even colder heart. "There he is," Custodia said, pointing her silver-tipped cane at Joachim. "The thief who fled the capital to hide his crimes on my estate. He's been poisoning the minds of my workers, Dr. Cavalcanti. He even stole a blank piece of paper from one of my slaves, claiming it was a legal document." Cavalcanti looked down at Joachim with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Joachim Duarte, I remember you. You were a promising clerk until you let your morals interfere with the minister's business. To think you've fallen so low." "I have the truth, Doctor," Joachim shouted, his voice cracking as the guards forced him to his knees in the mud. "The paper isn't blank. It's a shadow decree. It carries the seal of Dom Juan Sixix." The courtyard went silent. The Imperial Guards exchanged uneasy glances. Even Custodia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but then she let out that sharp, mocking laugh. "A shadow decree? On a coffee plantation?" she sneered. "You've been drinking too much of the local rot, Joachim. Show him, Silvera. Show the notary what we found in his office." Silvera stepped forward, holding a crumpled, yellowed scrap of paper. Joachim's heart stopped. But as Silvera flattened it out, Joachim realized it wasn't the deed. It was a fake, a decoy he had prepared days ago just in case. Cavalcanti took the paper, adjusted his spectacles, and turned it over. "It is completely empty, not even a watermark of quality." He sighed, looking at Custodia. "It seems the man is truly delusional. The cachaça has rotted his brain. Take him to the cellar," Custodia commanded, her eyes burning with triumph. "And bring the boy, Tiago. I want the notary to see the heir this drunkard has been dreaming about. We'll settle all the titles tonight at the banquet, and then we shall see who truly rules Alvorada." But as they dragged Joachim away, he caught Bento's eye. The old man was standing near the kitchens, his hands bound, but his spirit unbroken. Bento nodded slowly. He knew where the silver lion was, but that was only the beginning of the gamble. Joachim was in chains, the empty deed was hidden in a pile of trash, and Tiago was being hunted by Silvera's men. He had less than 3 hours before the notary signed the forged titles that would make Custodia's theft legal forever. He had to get out of that cellar, he had to get the inkwell, and he had to do it before the widow realized that the paper she had just mocked was the very thing that would strip her of her name, her wealth, and her freedom. The cellar was cold, smelling of damp earth and old wine, but the fire burning in Joachim's chest was hotter than any cachaça he had ever swallowed. Above him, he could hear the muffled sounds of music and laughter. The banquet had begun. Donna Custodia was celebrating her final victory, surrounded by the region's elite and the king's notary. She thought she had buried the truth in the mud, but she had forgotten that the oldest roots are often the hardest to pull. A soft scraping sound came from the small, barred window at the top of the cellar wall. Joachim looked up to see a pair of gnarled, familiar hands pushing something through the bars. It was the Silver Lion inkwell. Bento had found it in the trash, hidden beneath his own shirt, and brought it to the only man who could make it speak. "The boy is in the hall, Doctor," Bento's voice whispered from the shadows outside. "They are mocking him. They are calling him a slave to a dead name. Go, make the ink scream." Joachim didn't ask how Bento had evaded the guards. He simply took the inkwell, his fingers finding the secret latch. He unscrewed the lion's head and pulled out the parchment. The red ink was now dry, but the hidden script was vibrant, waiting for the final bath of the reagent to lock it into reality. With a heavy stone, Joachim smashed the rusted lock of the cellar door, a feat of strength he didn't know he possessed, and ran toward the big house. He burst into the grand dining room just as Dr. Cavalcanti was dipping his quill into a gold ink pot. Donna Custodia stood beside him, her hand resting on the forged land titles. Tiago was there, standing in the corner, his head bowed as the guests laughed at his royal delusions. "Stop!" Joachim's voice thundered through the hall, silencing the music and the clinking of crystal. Custodia's face turned a ghostly white, then a furious red. "Guards! Why is this animal not in chains?" "I am here as a witness of the crown," Joachim shouted, stepping toward the main table. He didn't look like a drunkard anymore. He looked like the royal clerk he was born to be. He carried a silver basin from a nearby sideboard and poured a clear, sharp-smelling liquid into it, the rest of his reagent. "You mocked a blank paper, Signor," Joachim said, his eyes locked on hers. "You laughed at a slave's empty deed. But the king's notary knows that the most important truths are often the ones you cannot see." Before anyone could stop him, Joachim submerged the empty parchment into the basin. In the absolute silence of the room, a deep crimson glow began to spread across the vellum. The royal seal of Dom Juan VI emerged in the center, followed by the elegant, undeniable calligraphy of the royal cabinet. Dr. Cavalcanti pushed his spectacles up his nose, his face turning pale as he read the first lines. This is a royal grant, a shadow decree of the highest order." He looked at Tiago, then at the document, then back at Custodia. "It names this boy as the ward of the crown, and it states that this land was never sold to the baron. It was entrusted to him as a prison for a prince." The quill fell from the notary's hand, staining the forged titles with a black blotch of failure. The widow's laughter was gone. In its place was the cold, terrifying silence of a kingdom falling apart. Donna Custodia reached for her silver-tipped cane, but the Imperial Guard had already stepped forward, their sabers a cold reminder that her reign was over. Her power, built on decades of forgeries and fear, evaporated in the heavy silence of the dining hall. Dr. Cavalcanti, the king's notary, declared Fazenda Alvarada a royal estate, granting immediate manumission to every enslaved soul as part of the crown's restitution for the hidden heir's safety. Tiago, the boy with the star, refused to leave for the palace in Rio, choosing instead to turn the blood-soaked land into a community for those who had survived it. Joachim remained at his desk, but the bottles of cachaça were gone forever. He became the record keeper of a new world, using the Silver Lion inkwell to write the names of free men and women into the annals of history. The final image of our story is that Silver Lion sitting on a simple wooden table in a room flooded with sunlight. Truth is like a hidden script. It may stay invisible for a generation, but it only takes one person with the courage to bring the heat for justice to appear. Dignity is not a title granted by a widow's laughter, but a right written in the blood of those who refuse to forget. If this journey of redemption and justice touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel to support our storytelling. I would love to hear from you, so please leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10 for this story. Your support is what keeps these hidden truths alive. Thank you for watching until the very end, and I look forward to seeing you in our next story.